Hey there, this is Hannah, Chief Rebel at DeSkills. Imagine your high schooler could learn to harness artificial intelligence to solve real world problems for small businesses and nonprofits. Imagine they could get paid doing these impact projects on the weekends or summer break. And imagine that as a result, they could leave high school with more experience and connections than most college graduates. That's DeSkills. Learn more at skills.io. That's dskills.io.
This podcast is funded by Ted Dintersmith, the executive producer of the acclaimed film Most Likely to Succeed, and the author of the best-selling book What School Could Be.
Hey everyone, welcome to the What School Could Be podcast. I'm your host, Josh Rapoon. Before we start the show, please check out all the resources at whatschoolcouldbe.org and our global online community. If you are a committed education change agent ready to roll up your sleeves and reimagine teaching and learning, simply install the What School Could Be app on your mobile device or navigate to community.whatschoolcouldbe.org. I hope to see you there. Today, my guest is Lee Fertig, the head of school at the Nueva School in the San Francisco Bay Area. Lee has more than 30 years of leadership and teaching experience in a wide variety of educational settings, including 5 international schools in Ethiopia, Brazil, Spain, and Belgium, a leading independent school in New York City, and a voluntary integration public magnet school in Minneapolis. In addition, for many years, Lee has been training at the Principals Training Center, known as the PTC. You will hear more about the PTC in a moment. Lee has taught at the College of Education at the University of Minnesota and is a guest speaker on contemporary education issues at a wide variety of community events. Nueva School is a place that brings together gifted students from across the Bay Area to engage in a pre-K through 12 educational program anchored by a community that is caring and compassionate. It is this unique combination of academic and social emotional learning that makes Nueva the school that it is and has been since 1967. At the core of what Nueva means by developing learners and thinkers who are bridgers across perspectives is the ability of its students to engage in deep learning across disciplines, to understand different ways of knowing about a particular concept, and to break down and construct systems that frame how we learn about things. It is a school and community dedicated to learning by doing and learning by caring. Robert Landau, a former guest on this show, wrote the following for this episode, and I quote, "During my recent visit to Nueva School, I witnessed head Lee Fertig's exceptional ability to interact and network. Seamlessly engaging with parents, teachers, and students, Lee demonstrated a relational, respectful, and encouraging demeanor, making everyone feel known and included. His smart, intuitive, and passionate approach and commitment to the future make him an educator I truly respect and admire," end quote. Because Lee and I dive into the Principals Training Center in this episode, I asked Robert Landau to say a word about it as well. Robert writes, and I quote, "Since its inaugural session in 1985 and first summer session in 1989, the Principals Training Center has stood as a beacon of excellence in educational leadership development, nurturing the potential of countless school leaders across the globe. It emboldens them with cutting-edge strategies, a deepened understanding of educational leadership, and a global network of peers. The PTC's unwavering commitment to excellence and innovation in leadership training remains unparalleled, genuinely embodying the pinnacle of professional development for educational leaders." And now, here's my conversation with Lee Fertig at the Nueva School in California. Lee Fertig, welcome to the What School Could Be podcast.
Thank you.
So Lee, you describe growing up in New York City and going to relatively large public schools, the, quote, fair amount of diversity in your childhood, and all your school years using the words fine and relatively easy. And you note that the really intense, deeper learning did not happen, for the most part, until you became, quote, a global nomad, living and working in 8 schools and 5 countries across 4 continents. And I found all this remarkably kind of countercultural, meaning our typical American way is to do school, grow up, get married, buy a house, settle down, till death do us part, and all that sort of thing. You clearly took the road less traveled. And I wonder when your global nomad life began, and I wonder why your global nomad life began.
Yes, Josh, it's a good question. My global nomad life began about 5 years after graduating from undergraduate college. So I worked at a private school in New York City called the Fieldston School for 5 years, right out of college. And I loved my life there. I was enjoying teaching there and all of that. And I had family and friends, but I always had an interest in seeing other parts of the world. And where does that come from? An older brother who did a little bit of travel and living abroad, some friends and a former girlfriend who told me about schools and international schools abroad. And that's kind of what prompted me to think about a life outside of the US. And I have absolutely no regrets whatsoever. It's a life that I value everything that it's given me and my family and my professional career.
And what was the first moment, like what was the first international school that came onto your radar screen, or that first moment where you thought, I'm okay, I'm going to take a jump at this and see what happens?
And so what happened, and this was back a long time ago, it was back in 1988, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And I traveled down from New York, where I was living and working, to Washington, D.C., where there was one of these international school recruitment conferences where an external agency sets up these venues to match educators and school leaders in the US and Canada and North America with international schools abroad. I think it happened probably in February of that year. And I was open to anything, Josh. And you talk to people who are representing schools and you set up interviews during these weekend-long fairs. And I ended up signing on with a school in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Wow.
So talk about the road less traveled. It's not what many people do from New York City.
Right.
But I really connected with the director of the school at the time. East Africa seemed like a magical place that I'd like to get to know a little bit more about. And so I signed my name on the contract, and a few months later, I headed off to Ethiopia.
Wow. What a story. That's amazing. So let me come at this from a different direction, Lee. You are unique, in my humble opinion, because you have, except for a couple of years, been in education your entire life. And on the other hand, you've been this global nomad. And I really find this fascinating. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about being in one field, but being a nomad in that field. Like what is that like? Or what are some things that our listeners can know about you in that sense of, being in education all your life, but also being somebody who has been around the world, literally?
Yeah, so I do consider myself a lifelong educator and a school person. I've been in schools with, like you said, with just the exception of a couple of years, my entire life, but all over the place. And actually, to this point, up until today, I've never been in one school community for longer than 6 years. And some people may be shocked at that. I always left on my own accord. I always was in a good place and happy when I did leave a school community. And I think one of the differences between that and a lifelong career in 1 or 2 school settings, I believe that it is an enriching experience as an educator, as a teacher, as a school leader, especially in terms of leadership, Josh. The demands that each situation, each setting, each context places upon somebody who moves around like this, like I did, is it really, I've had no choice but to be what is often referred to as a situational leader,
Hmm.
somebody who is attempting to meet people and communities where they are and not just bring my own vision and philosophy of education
Hmm.
and unilaterally decide to impose that upon a community.
Wow. So that's fascinating. So as you have moved in your nomadic mode, as you come into a community, it sounds like you're there for them, albeit for a period of time, and you're there to empower them and to help them achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve. But when the time comes, you move on to the next moment when you do that again. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
It is. I do approach leadership and my life, if I may be so bold,
Hmm.
as empowering others, exactly like you just said, serving others in community.
Hmm.
And I've been happy when I leave a place, but there's a certain itch that I and my family get that wants us to try something new, to jump into a yet another novel situation and bring whatever leadership talent and expertise I can to that new situation as well.
Hmm. So I want to get into some questions about leadership, but actually, for a second, I'd love to go back to Ethiopia. And I wonder,
Sure.
what was it about that particular person that you connected with? And what was that moment like? That only happens once, that very first moment. And I can
Yeah.
imagine you, Lee, going in eyes wide open on that, just trying to soak up everything that was happening. So what drew you there? What was the connection that you made there?
It is true. I reflect on that moment in time, and it does only happen once. And so, what were the features of that moment that were so special and resonated with me? I think I was hungry. I think I was looking for not only newness, excitement, adventure, and novelty in my life, in my living, in my life experiences, but very specifically professionally as well. I,
Hmm.
I had been I was in a little bit of a quasi leadership role at the school in New York City where I was working,
Hmm.
and I liked it. I
Hmm.
was a director of student activities of sorts, and I wanted a little bit more of school leadership and looking at school communities with a wider lens than a teacher typically gets the opportunity to do. And this particular person he was the director of the school in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I think he saw that hunger in me and he was interested in cultivating it,
Hmm.
and he was interested in giving me opportunity and giving me a chance to exercise that.
Hmm. Wow. That's just, I can only imagine what that must have been like. And then there must have been some sort of like, maybe not quite a J curve early on, but a pretty rapidly rising curve of understanding of what leadership is. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, very much so. A new community, a foreign country. That school community in particular, Josh, was highly, highly international because
Hmm.
so many of the relief and rehabilitation agencies that work in an impoverished country like Ethiopia, the United Nations Development Program, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services,
Hmm.
and all the embassies, all those organizations had families that sent their kids to this school. So it was truly an international community that brought so many different sets of expectations and perspectives to the table. And as a leader, that's invigorating. It's
Hmm.
exciting. It's a little bit overwhelming at times.
Hmm.
It's good fodder for leadership growth.
So that's great because I think for many of our listeners, Lee, the notion of an international school is a little bit difficult to grasp. And oftentimes the name of the school is something like the American International School in, wherever.
Correct.
And so maybe if you could just take a second and say a little bit more about what is there kind of a typical population, student parent population at international schools, and what is that typical population?
Yeah. I think there are several typical populations and
Hmm.
profiles of these schools. Some of them are similar to the one I just described. They are very, very international communities due to the international workforce that that is in those cities.
Mm.
So schools, for example, like the school in Brussels, Belgium, where I was at for a few years, is very, very international due to not only commerce, but all of the European Union and NATO and all of the international requirements that those organizations have. Some of the other international schools, Josh, might lean a little bit more toward emphasizing educating the local population.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
even though they are American or international schools, they might serve 90 or 90, maybe 95% of their student body is from the country itself.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the schools in Latin America were traditionally like that. Some of the schools maybe in Africa or Asia as well. And then there's a lot of hybrids in between those two extremes.
Mm.
And in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, there's a huge increase in the number of for-profit schools that are owned either by private families or companies that are funded by private equity.
Right.
And that's a rapidly changing development in the international school circuit.
So it's fair to say that, across these various typical communities, diversity, for the most part, is pretty typical. I mean, it's actually maybe even desired by the parents and students who are there.
Extremely, yeah. In most of these places, diversity, as we know it, is an inherent characteristic of these schools, regardless of any of those profiles that I just shared with you. And so I think the notion of diversity and the notions of belonging that we address so eagerly and enthusiastically now in the US and North America,
Yeah.
in some ways, they've been approached, albeit slightly differently, but they've been approached by their very nature in these international schools for decades.
So perfect segue then to my next question, which is that you noted to me that in every school community you've been in, you have led initiatives that increase access and amplify agency. And I will note here that one of my former guests on this show has spoken often about the idea that where you spend your time reflects what you value. And this would be a great moment, Lee, to explain what access and agency means to you and why they mean so much, and how specifically your work as a board member at the community organization in Peninsula Bridge reflects your values and what you care about.
It's a good question, Josh. And I think it started for me years and years ago. I've already made reference to, I was a young teacher slash quasi leader in a school that I had a taste of the importance of viewing kids and the teaching and learning processes broadly. And it was not enough for me back then to only teach math, which is what I taught in those first few years. And I also spoke to some colleagues where it was maybe not enough for them to only teach English or third grade. As important as those are,
Yeah.
I was somebody who needed and wanted to see the educational process in a more macro way. And what I learned early on is that kids, young people, do best when they co-own, when they have some ownership over the learning process. And I also know, and to this day it's still true, that many kids should and could have access to some of the better schools on the planet, and yet they don't, strictly due to socioeconomic and other reasons. And so both of those things about access, the latter one, as well as the agency, just came to me really early on. And I've kind of devoted every ounce of my being over the years across all these settings to really focus on those two important constructs. And I think they still resonate with me today.
So amplifying agency, how does the amplify part work?
I think kids are naturally, Josh. They're curious. They're inquisitive. They tend to have a natural desire to know themselves and know the world around them. And yet, I think as a society, we often, and maybe it's inadvertent, maybe it's unintentional,
Hmm.
but we often squash that.
Hmm.
We often flatten that to a point where we're actually doing everything we can not to encourage them
Yeah.
to be curious learners. And so as schools as a societal institution, we have an amazing opportunity and an immense responsibility and a privilege, if you will, to ensure that we perpetuate that natural curiosity cycle that kids bring to the table.
Hmm.
And so that's where the amplification comes in. I want to grab what they already have within them and make sure that they can exercise that muscle
Hmm.
in developmentally appropriate ways. And so it's really about in what ways can students at different ages co-own the learning process? In what ways can they partner with the so-called expert teacher
Hmm.
to kind of create a little bit of the learning activity and the assessment of their own learning
Right.
throughout their learning journey?
Yeah, that's been a theme that has come up often in the last, 18 months, Lee, as I've interviewed guests, is the idea of co-creation and the ways that when you grow that, you get that amplification of agency, which is a really, really cool idea. And then there's something else, related to what happened during the pandemic, but I'm going to push that off until later because I have a specific question about that.
Okay.
But there's one more question before we go to our first break, but still staying with leadership, but also including the concept of school culture. You shared with me a list of books that have been influential in your life, and one of them is titled The Advantage: Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else in Business by Patrick Lencioni. I believe I'm pronouncing that right.
Correct.
So looking down from above, Lee, and noting the advantage of being a self-described global nomad who's been part of and shaped many school cultures, what does organizational health mean in the context of education, public or private? Like, what does organizational health look and sound and feel like?
It's an excellent inquiry, Josh. And what it makes me think about when you frame the question in that way is what are our and what should our metrics of success be
Yeah.
in terms of building healthy school communities? And there's a lot of the world is just really going to focus on whether it be an SAT score or a college acceptance list or grades or GPA. And I know where all of those traditional quantitative singular metrics have come from.
Yeah.
I know the purposes that they've attempted to serve, but there's no reason for us as schools and educators and school communities right now to continue to consider those our success metrics. Those don't make an organization, especially a school community, healthy. They don't. What makes a school healthy, what makes a school community healthy, and in turn, society at large, is to create, if the business folks want to use the word products, sure, we'll use products. Our products are young people.
Yeah.
They're human beings. And we are to create and establish and amplify what they already bring to us so that they become ethically engaged global citizens. So they're enabled and empowered to make choices that benefit this world in some way. That's a sign of health and success in our organizations. If we can actually point to kids who then attribute who they are and all the wonderful things they're doing to their previous school life and say, that school made me who I am today and influenced me in these positive ways. There's nothing healthier or more successful than that.
So again, just one more follow-up before we go to break. So you travel a lot. I'm sure that you visit many, many schools. Lee, when you walk in the door, what's the first sign to you that you're walking into a healthy organization?
Joy, fun, humor, laughter. engagement.
And you can see that when you come in.
I think most people, even the layperson's eyes, can actually see that within the first few minutes. And maybe you need to scratch the surface a little bit. Maybe you need to spend a little bit more time there. But I think kids who seamlessly are exhibiting joy and engagement and working with each other with smiles on their faces and pushing each other in constructive ways to be better. When you see students who are not only advocating for themselves fiercely, it's that agency piece again, but also advocating for their learner colleagues around them, their classmates, and empowering them as well. That's a sign of, I think, a community that's either already very healthy or right on the cusp of being incredibly healthy.
Wow. You take me back to a moment, 7 years ago, Lee, when I visited a school on Maui. I'm obviously based in Hawaii, and I visited an elementary school on Maui, and I walked into a fifth grade class that was dealing in a unit of science. But basically what was happening is the kids were preparing to put on a piece of theater in which each of the kids had taken on the role of one of the elements in the table of elements. And they were doing it in Hawaiian.
I love that.
So there was language and there was science and there was, oh boy, right? And that was one of the first things that I saw, and it took my breath away.
Yeah. And Josh, it's not, those things can be overly scripted and an observer will notice when they're overly scripted.
Yeah.
But when they're not overly scripted, and there's a little bit of serendipity in there, and there's a little bit of messiness and chaos, that is meeting the learners, these young people, where they are. Yeah. Because that's their view, that's their outlook toward life. And so when we meet them where they are and allow the time and space for a little bit of messiness and chaos, I think that's what facilitates the joy and the engagement.
And thereby the health of the organization, as we talked about. Beautiful. So, hey, everyone, we've been talking to Lee Fertig, the head of the Nueva School in California. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What does the future of learning look like? All the big changes going on in tech and society these days are raising tough and fascinating questions about education and where it's going. We dig into those questions every week on the EdSurge podcast. I'm Jeff Young, an editor and a reporter at EdSurge, and I sit down with educators, students, and scholars for frank and in-depth conversations about how education is changing. You can find the EdSurge podcast wherever you listen, or just go to edsurge.com and click on the podcast link. I hope you'll check it out.
Hi, I'm Ricardo.
I'm Mary. And I'm Liz.
And we co-host Course Stories, a podcast produced by the Instructional Design and New Media team at Arizona State University.
In this podcast, we tell an array of course design stories alongside other ASU online designers and faculty.
Join us as we talk to the course design experts about shaping the future of online education. Tune into Course Stories, where innovation meets instruction.
Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Course Stories!
Perfection.
Hi, friends. This is Toy Hirschman from EntreEd. It is my great honor to uplift this excellent podcast, What School Could Be. As always, we are super excited to support innovation in education. We've been lucky enough to feature some of the incredible What School Could Be educators on our podcast. If you are looking to be inspired by entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial educators and other great minds from across the world, check out the EntreEd Talk podcast, and please like and subscribe and leave a review. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey everyone, we are back with Lee Fertig, head of school at the Nueva School and a futurist with more than 30 years of leadership and teaching experience in a wide variety of educational settings. So, Lee, let's say you, the global nomad who has worked for years as a trainer for the Principal Training Center, have been invited to spend several days at a large public school in, let's say, the city of Dallas. and you're given full access and the opportunity to see, hear, and experience anything you want, morning, noon, and night. So what evidence are you looking for that would confirm this school is run by a good or even great leader? Like, to use your words, Lee, what are the telling signs of good leadership?
That's a good question, and it's framed in a way that really forces me to put my money where my mouth is here. So let's get into it.
Okay.
The evidence that I would be looking for to show that that school is in good leadership hands are the following, in no particular order. One, I think it needs to be very clear up front that there's not one person that is running the show. There has to be some evidence of distributed or decentralized leadership. There has to be some evidence that there is a team, and hopefully a cohesive team and an aligned team that is kind of exercising the same type of leadership muscle in that community, honoring the same values that the community holds. One person is not leadership. It's that simple. Leadership is a social endeavor, and it's a team sport. Another piece of evidence I would be looking for is to what extent are all people in the community, all constituents, students, teachers, faculty, staff, parents, alumni, if they're there, to what extent do they genuinely feel empowered and somewhat autonomous to not only do their jobs, but, and I say this very intentionally, to fail forward. They need to feel like they're expected to do really, really well and even try some new things sometimes. And if it doesn't work out as they intended or as they planned, as long as they pick themselves up, dust their boots off and get back in the saddle and try something again and are supported in that effort by their leadership, I think that's also a sign of good leadership. And as we talked about right before the break, I think if there's no joy in the learning process exhibited by the kids, or if there's too little joy and engagement and not enough agency being exhibited, then I do wonder, is leadership properly attending to that piece as well, or have they fallen short in that?
And you take me back again to the school on Maui. It was called Pomaikai Elementary. And I recall, Lee, the day that I visited there, I had a chance to meet with so many of the faculty, but it was also a day when the principal was not there. And what I heard really loud and clear from the faculty was that they were sort of trying to principal-proof the school in the sense, right, that it was a shared leadership model, but they were afraid that the principal was going to say, well, our test scores are down, so that piece of theater that you're doing over there on the elements, that can't happen. You have to. Right. And so the shared leadership part seems very important then, right?
It's very important. I mean, when I do leadership courses and leadership training, one of the messages I really, really attempt to highlight and emphasize is the signs of good leadership, the metrics of whether a leader has done their job well or not, is after they leave the community. For a leader not to be present in a community, but for some of the structures and processes and the cultural elements to sustain themselves over time, even after that leader has departed, that's a sign of good leadership.
And I think I also want to make a distinction between the kind of visit that I just sent you on to this school in Dallas versus, for example, a WASC accreditation, where everybody is geared up and they know what's coming and they're anticipating the questions that are going to be asked. But in your case, you're just popping by, and that's different, right?
It is, and I would argue that when I or others serve on an accreditation team, we need to be aware of that potential for artificiality, if you will.
Yeah.
And we need to dig a little bit. The best part of accreditation visits for me is spending time, albeit limited time, with the kids, with the students, whether it's sitting on a bench in the playground or having lunch with them and just getting a sense from them. Kids, as you know, Josh, young kids, they'll be as honest, clear, and transparent as we allow them to be.
Yeah.
And I think they can really tell the story of the school.
That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. So, Lee, as we speak today, the national phenomenon that is March Madness, the NCAA basketball tournament, is fully underway, and the men's and women's Final Four games will happen in a few days. And I've been thinking a lot about what makes for great coaching. So, what is the role of coaching in the process of becoming and being a great school leader?
Yeah, coaching is an inevitable part of really good leadership, obviously. And I think the importance about when we talk about coaching, it's really important to acknowledge that it comes in very many different sizes, shapes, and flavors. And that goes back to that notion of situational leadership that I shared early on in our podcast. And what I mean by that is sometimes some people, some individuals, some teams, some divisions, some school communities at large, they require different things at different times in their journey. And so coaching can either be quite directive, and it also could be quite a lot more passive in terms of supporting and just simply providing resources for a group of people as well. And a leader needs to have the style flexibility to go in and out of those different situations. Good leaders need to assess each situation quickly and accurately on what kind of coaching is required of me at this moment in time with this particular group. What level of commitment do they have to the task at hand? What level of competence do they have? And then coach accordingly. And that's why leadership is so fatiguing.
Yeah.
That's why I love it. It's the most exciting and invigorating thing that I've done for decades, but it's absolutely exhausting because there's so much code switching as a leader if you engage in situational leadership really well.
Yeah, Lee, I've been noticing this most especially on the women's side and women's basketball, is that when the TV stays with you, instead of going to break, or leaves you still on the court, and you watch the teams go to their coach, sometimes it's the coach who's directing everything, speaking to everybody and telling them what to do. And oftentimes it's the coach, especially on the women's side, who steps back and the players are talking to each other.
Yes.
And I just started picking up on this, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting,
And that's a perfect example of learners and players advocating for themselves and those that they interact with.
Right.
And they can do it, and they will do it, and they might even do it more effectively if it's intrinsic rather than extrinsic coming from some top-down leader.
Right. And you're exhausted as the coach because you're code switching and trying to figure out, is this the moment?
Right.
Do I step back a little bit or do I step in?
Exactly.
So, Lee, you shared with me a document titled TLC, a roadmap to lead through uncertainty. And TLC stands for Transparency, Learning, and Culture. And I read your words in this document really carefully. And this is the question that emerged for me. In your opinion, did what it means to be a really good or great school leader, public, private, or charter, fundamentally change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
My initial response, and I think I'm going to stick with it, is actually no. I think many people would disagree with me. But the reason why I'm saying no, and I don't want to dismiss the severity and the impact of the pandemic, the tragic despair that it created in society at large. It was brutal. And yet, it also can be seen as just one more obstacle, barrier, hindrance, challenge, dilemma that is thrust upon us as leaders of schools and other societal institutions. So I say that, and this is coming from my international experience, Josh. In Ethiopia, I was part of a leadership team in the international school there, where we lived through 2 military coups with tanks on the street, and there were times when we had to hide our students. I've been in places where currency has devalued 200, 400, 700% overnight in a developing economy. And you can imagine what that does to the community. And so I share these rather dramatic examples just to suggest that good leadership should be able to handle adverse circumstances, even if they're novel. That might be an unfair expectation of my leadership colleagues, but I actually do believe the pandemic was, for me at least, yet another big, significant leadership challenge. But I adjusted. I actually changed schools in July 2020.
Wow.
I came into my current setting at the peak of the pandemic. And as the head of a school, you can imagine it's all about relationship building. It's all about building that trust right off the bat. And I didn't have access. I did not have in-person access to any of those parents or kids or teachers.
Yeah.
And so I actually had to come up with creative ways in which I can build those relationships virtually and otherwise. And I did.
Yeah.
And so I think if the pandemic did anything, Josh, it encouraged leaders to dig deeper into their leadership toolkit.
Yeah, and my mind, which I'm very grateful to you because of what you wrote, and it just set my mind, running around in circles trying to figure this out for myself. And I think I came down where you have come down, which is that life is a series of giant disruptions that we, in that black swan sense, can't really know when they're going to happen. And so as a leader, you're just going to have to deal. I mean, here we are in the age of now AI, which has burst on us.
Correct.
And another giant one. But my thought was, and going back to something we talked about earlier, that maybe the only possibly fundamental change is that access increased because of the knowledge we gained from using Zoom. We've now made it possible for kids to learn not just on a campus during a given set of hours.
Yes.
And that's something that has, for leaders, for school leaders, where they have picked up and begun to leverage this idea, has created more access.
Yes, I think it has created more access and more differentiated opportunities in that respect. It's also created more of a window into the learning process for parents
that
they didn't have before.
Yeah.
But all of these things, Josh, they represent a shifting landscape of something that is still at the heart of schools and what they do and what leaders in schools must do. And that is to empower learners to bring out the best of who they are, to amplify their agency, and like you said, to increase access. But the access piece is interesting because it does thrust upon us as leaders another challenge, a dilemma that we have to consider, and that is, when is it most appropriate to engage in the educative process virtually via Zoom?
Right.
And when is it necessary or most important to actually honor and hold on to that in-person learning environment?
Right.
And I think a lot of schools and a lot of leaders are grappling with, what's the emphasis here? Which types of activities are most conducive to which venue? So it's yet another leadership challenge to consider with that increased access.
Yeah, going back to what you said about coaching, right? It's another one of those code switching moments.
Yes.
And that comes with time and it comes with experience as you learn how to do that. Okay, so let's shift towards Nueva School before we go to our second break. So Lee, you shared with me the cover letter you wrote to the search committee at Nueva School, a letter where you officially threw your hat in the ring as the possible next head of school. And in that letter, you start with a quote from a book titled The Shadow of the Wind. And that quote is, few things leave a deeper mark on a reader than the first book that finds its way into his heart. No matter how many books we read, how many worlds we discover, or how much we learn or forget, we will return, end quote. So what was it about Nueva School that prompted you to start your letter with this quote? Like, what was the deeper mark left on you as you returned to the idea of being at Nueva? What found its way into your heart?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I was not really interested in switching jobs at that particular moment in time. My family and I were happy where we were. We were in Europe at the time, and I was headhunted, and I was convinced to at least throw my name in the hat. I threw my name in the hat. I had one or two virtual interviews, and then it was through those one or two kind of preliminary conversations where I met in a very brief amount of time board members at Nueva, some teachers, a couple of students. I just met different stakeholder group representatives, and in those brief but meaningful conversations, it dawned on me really quite clearly and quickly that this was a special place, and that the first impressions that I observed from those initial conversations did indeed leave a deep mark on me. And the deep mark specifically had to do with agency more than anything else. I've been in schools all over the world and my entire life, and many schools do an amazing job amplifying that agency and enabling kids to be kind of co-creators of the learning journey. But I hadn't realized the extent that that can go to until I started having those initial conversations at Nueva. And that was the deep mark that resonated with me.
Wow. It's so cool, Lee, that I get a chance to talk to you today, because it is at Nueva that deep mark was left on me. I living here in Hawaii and teaching, I started out on a quest to find what I was not sure I was even looking for, but I knew it was out there. And I don't even think I had the names yet of agency and, student voice and things like that. And somebody said to me, and this was at the time that Nueva was still a middle school, or only a middle school, and somebody said, you have to visit Nueva. And I remember coming on campus, and Hillary Freeman took me to the iLab, and it just, another one of those, it took my breath away moments. And I knew that left a mark on my heart forever. Yeah. It changed the arc of my life, I think, forever. Yeah. And it also turned out that shortly after that, I visited the D School at Stanford. And then the mark was truly imprinted, if you know what I mean. But that's what that moment meant to me. And it sounds like it did to you.
Yeah, it did very much. And as I continued with the interview process, and then when I got the job, and now this is, I'm finishing my 4 years here, and I'm planning to spend a few more years here. That mark has not gone away. When candidates for jobs that I interviewed, Josh, when they ask me what drew me here, and why do I stay here, it's actually, there's two things that I share with them. Yeah. One is literally the agency, the learn by doing part of our ethos here at Nueva. And the other one is the learn by caring part. Yeah. And that is something that's very palpable when you walk through the hallways of Nueva as well.
Yeah, it sure is. I recall like it was yesterday, coming around a corner in the iLab, and there was this middle school student with what looked like a motorcycle helmet on, and he was holding some giant power tool. And he had this look in his eye, and it's just like, be careful, I'm making something. And I was like, oh boy, I'm in love. So Lee, one more question, before we go to break. I'm just going to squeeze this one in. You shared with me that at Nueva School, your community uses Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community framework to guide your work. So this really caught my attention. So what is this beloved community framework, and how does it guide the work at the Nueva School?
We've been doing it for years, but we've become better at articulating it and making it more tangible since 2020, since the pandemic, since the George Floyd murder. We embrace the tenets of Dr. King's beloved community because they are strengths-based rather than deficit-based. They focus on respect, dignity, love, teamwork, and they're aspirational and, according to Dr. King, yet achievable. And we kind of frame a lot of our what we call equity and inclusion work, what a lot of schools would call, DEI, JB work. We frame a lot of it around the beloved community through how do we enhance relationships that honor people's dignity, that earn their respect? How do we make sure that love is actually shared amongst community members? A really quick example, hopefully we have time before a break.
Sure.
In the upper school, it's grades 9 through 12, there's 450 students, 60 to 70 adult staff members. We probably have, let's say 520, 530 community members who are regularly on our high school campus. Every February it typically falls along Valentine's Day week, mid-February, we do kindness envelopes. This is a student-generated activity where every single member, from me to the receptionist, to the cook in the kitchen, to the security guard, has a red envelope taped up to a wall in the school with a photo of us, every single individual community member. And throughout that week, all community members are encouraged to write on little strips of paper things that we appreciate about each other, things that they've done for us that have facilitated our own growth. And at the end of the week, on Friday afternoon, everybody takes their kindness envelope home and gets to read through that and celebrate it. This is not moderated. It's not monitored. It's not censored. It is what it is. It is kindness in its purest, most loving form. It's just one example of how that learn by caring ethos really comes to life at Nueva.
Wow, beautiful. Great way to take us to our second break. So, hey everyone, we have been talking to Lee Fertig, the head of the Nueva School in California. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi, fellow educators. I'm Steve Shapiro, and like you, I'm excited about the possibilities of what school could be. Please check out my podcast, Experience Matters, where I talk to guests ranging from big national thinkers like Daniel Pink and Tony Wagner to recent high school graduates about the most profound learning experiences of their youth. Then we dig into the implications for how we can reshape schools to produce powerful breakthrough learning for all of our students. Education can take many forms, but whatever form it takes, experience matters.
Hey there. Are you interested in hearing weekly conversations with authors, leaders, and practitioners at the forefront of learning and education innovation? Then you'll love the Getting Smart podcast. This podcast amplifies the incredible work being done by some of the most innovative minds in education. Learn new leadership styles, new technologies, new frameworks and mindsets, and get the fuel you need to stay motivated and curious. Together, we can empower all learners to thrive. It's available at gettingsmart.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Are you ready to shake things up in the classroom? Then get ready to blast off into the future of education with the Teacher Nerds podcast. Join Joe DiPaolo and Ron Nober as they share their own experiences, as well as talk with guests who are experts and innovators in education. From engaging teaching techniques to the latest educational technology, this podcast is a must-listen for anyone passionate about the future of learning. Subscribe and get ready to learn with the Teacher Nerds podcast.
Hey everyone, we are back with Lee Fertig, the head of the Nueva School in California and a trainer for the Principals Training Center, which, according to one of my former guests on this show, has stood as a beacon of excellence in educational leadership development, nurturing the potential of countless school leaders across the globe. So Lee, in light of the Nueva School's commitment to gifted education, where you champion the belief that all gifted learners have the right to, quote, choose which of their talent areas they wish to pursue, while emphasizing the importance of equity for learners, student agency, and empowerment, could you share with us any initiatives or outreach programs your school has developed? Like, how do these programs convey your students' unique approaches and achievements to the broader community outside of Nueva? And how do you ensure that the philosophy of empowering students to pursue their individual talents and gifts is shared beyond the confines of Nueva.
Yes, it's important to us to answer that question very accurately and also to share it with the wider world. We're a mission-aligned school. We're a mission-driven school community, and many schools say that, and they do it, and that's fantastic. We actually profess, Josh, to have two missions. Okay. So one of our missions, what we call Mission One, is to serve gifted students throughout the Bay Area, to enable them to make choices that benefit the world. Mission Two, which has been a real concrete, tangible thing in Nueva for many, many years, is to know that we're situated in the larger ecosystem of society and other schools and other nonprofit organizations and private sector and families and churches and things like that. And mission two is for us to share, to facilitate the sharing of ideas, resources, hopes, challenges with others, mostly with other educators, but even with other organizations in the community. Our kids and teachers are out and about all the time. We also bring in a lot of the rest of society into our buildings as much as we can. A couple of examples. Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons, we host maybe between 130 and 150 middle school students that are participating in something called the Peninsula Bridge Program. It's a community-based organization that works with students from disadvantaged backgrounds to help them get into and have access to independent schools and other schooling systems so that they have a more enriched educational environment. Our students serve as teachers and teaching assistants. Our teachers serve in that program as teachers. So that's just one example of how we do that. We host institutes all the time, summer institutes and conferences throughout the school year in gifted education, equity and inclusion, design thinking, social emotional learning. Every other year in October, we host the Innovative Learning Conference, the ILC. And I would really encourage our guests to keep their eyes and ears open for the next one in 2025, because these are opportunities for Nueva to share some of the fortunate resources and talent that we do have with the wider world. And we're committed to doing that as much as we can.
You know, Lee, I worked for a head of school here in Honolulu who used to say quite regularly to his greater community, most especially to his faculty and students, to whom much is given, much is required.
Yes.
And his name is Jim Scott, and he was the president at Punahou School for 25 years. And it sounds like that notion is embedded in how you approach this idea of serving gifted students and the ways that they give back as a result of being served for the gifts that they have. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
It is. And I think it's a journey that we're on, Josh. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's always room for improvement. But we talk very, very authentically about enabling gifted learners to make choices that benefit the world.
Yeah.
And we come back to that all the time. So whether it's in our STEM classes in the innovation lab, whether it's in the social emotional learning classes or design thinking or math or English or whatever it might be, we want our young people here to learn the competencies, the concepts, the skills that are in that subject matter, and also to constantly think about applicability and transfer to other settings that potentially could enable others to have a better life.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly asking them to think about those things.
The webpage that you have, your school's webpage that's devoted to the gifted part, the Learn More, when you click on that button, I think I spent more time there than almost anywhere else because I was just so fascinated by that.
Yeah. Josh, the thing is, people have a lot of myths out there about who gifted learners are and what characterizes them.
Yeah.
Here's a couple of interesting facts. One is a lot of gifted learners are prone to being engaged in issues of justice and inequity. And there's a certain almost perfectionism that's a part of the gifted learner profile that when applied toward things that are happening in the outside world that just don't seem right or fair or just, these kids, they feel the weight of that and they want to do something about it, and they do have the agency to do something about it.
Yeah, fabulous. Wow. So, okay, Lee, one more specific question about Nueva before we come towards the end of our awesome conversation. Well, I'll just throw it at you. Here we go. So, Lee, I'm a prospective parent about to tour your school in 2054, 30 years from now. And you, still the head of school, having not aged a day.
Of course.
Of course, right? You meet me at my car and tell me in less than 3 minutes what I'm about to see and experience. Ready, set, go.
Welcome to Nueva. We're thrilled that you're here for the visit. I think you're in for a real treat. And I want you to know that you've seen it in our literature on our website. You've heard our community members already talk about it. We talk a lot about learn by doing and learn by caring. And I encourage you to look for signs of that. It's all over. You will see inquiry project-based, student-centered work. Kids are not sitting, they're moving, they're interacting with each other. There's a lot of fluidity in the learning process. You're going to see a ton of learn by doing. And I think you're also going to see a ton of learn by caring. You're going to see kids in their own unique ways advocate for themselves and also stick their necks out for their classmates and make sure that their classmates are learning to the best of their ability as well. And so I think you're going to see this learn by doing, learn by caring ethos loud and clear. And I encourage you to talk to people that you run into, students, teachers, the principal, parents that may be volunteering at this event today. I encourage you to talk to them about, is this real? In what other ways does this show up? How do you know that my child is going to enter this ecosystem and be successful? We want you to talk to our community members because they went through what you were going to go through as well.
So I think the thrust of the question and what I'm really thinking about is, and I think you've spoken very clearly to it, is that 30 years from now, I mean, it's possible, right, Lee, that 30 years from now, the so-called AI disruption that we're going through right now might seem like a piece of, like patty cakes. Like we have no idea what's around the corner. But those of us like you, futurists, are thinking about that a lot. But what you're speaking to is the constant. And the constant is always going to be learn by doing, learn by caring, right? Is that the way?
That is absolutely what I'm saying. And I would even go one step further.
Yeah.
I think a good futurist also looks back on previous decades or centuries of change and shifts and learns what has remained constant even over those significant shifts. And I think what we've learned, and the recent years, Josh, I think are very telling.
Yeah.
I think we've learned that education continues to be a human-centered endeavor.
Yeah.
It's still about young human beings who might have all kinds of different tools and strategies with AI and everything in their toolkit now, but it's still a human-centered realm. And so I don't envision the schools as centers of community where people are coming together in person. I don't envision that changing. I think that's going to be a constant. I think there's going to be more access virtually. I think there's going to be more opportunities to differentiate with some new technology platforms. But I just read an article about the people who are about to benefit the most with the advent of AI are English majors. And the reason why is because they're trained to actually understand human-centered prompting.
Yeah.
It's about the prompting of the machine. And so I still think that's a constant for us as educators and leaders moving into the future.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to slide in one more, 30,000 foot question here before we get towards the end of this conversation. Boy, Lee, something you wrote confirmed that I absolutely must ask you one of these hot air balloon questions, the kind where you get to look down on the entire landscape and you know what I mean. So you mentioned Nueva's interest in our civic discourse on teaching and learning in schools. And boy, oh boy, if there was a time in our history, Lee, when the discourse on education was more fragile or more emotional, I don't know when that was. And I taught history for a long time. There's a lot of throwing other people's ideas about education under the bus going on and crazy, school board meetings and things like that. So What are your meta thoughts about all this? Like, how can we, or can we, ever get on the same page about the purpose and the process of education?
I think we can and we need to, and it's an uphill battle. And I think a lot about this, Josh. And I believe strongly that two things need to happen to make this work. Number one, for a long, long time, but especially since 2020, with the pandemic and political and social polarization in our community and all of that, it's so important, first and foremost, that people feel accepted, that they feel like they belong in a community. And this is why all the work being done with affinity groups in schools and other societal institutions, with connecting with those that I have some similarities with, making sure that psychological and physical safety is important to me with all the identities I bring to something. That notion of identity and belonging is so important. And that's why so many schools are focusing on it, as they should.
Yeah.
And if we stop there and never implement number two that I'm about to share with you, we've lost a grand opportunity. And what number two is in addition to making sure people feel safe and they have affinity with those that they feel comfortable with and they feel like they truly belong and this is home for them. In addition to that, we need to create the opportunities where people do have discourse and dialogue across perspectives. And too often I'm finding that schools and other organizations are stopping after number one. And they're not fostering the bridging across difference, which is what I've devoted my entire career to. And it's so important for us to create structured, safe places where people are encountering difference and diversity in thought and perspective, because without that, we don't have a chance to solve the challenges of civic discourse in front of us. We need to have young people exercise that at a young age and to let it become seamless, like riding a bike. And if you do that, then we have a chance of having a much more kind of professional demeanor in our discourse with each other.
Wow. Thank you for that, Lee. I found myself slipping recently, that my frustration with the stubbornness of traditional education has gotten the better of me in a couple of occasions recently. And I felt as if I was pulling up the bridge and sliding it over to my side and saying, "Oh, the hell with it. I can't do this." And so I feel inspired again to reach out. And when that happens, right, when you pull that bridge back, the anger that you feel inside or the frustration that you feel comes out in the words that you use. Absolutely. And it happened for me on LinkedIn. And a dear friend of mine who's a Buddhist, pointed out to me that I needed to go back to being the bridging Josh and not the burning the bridges Josh, Yeah.
Leaders and everybody right now, Josh, need to seek out divergent perspectives in order to make this a better world for everybody to live in. And you need to feel safe in and comfortable with who you are and your own identities to do that.
Yeah.
And that's why both sides of that work that I describe are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Lee, we're going to return to the leadership question in a big way here. At the end of every episode, I ask guests to share a shout out to a giant upon whose shoulders they stand. And in your case, you were very specific about a series of giants, of great leaders. So I thought I would change things up a bit and have you speak about each one of them one by one. Okay, so here goes. So number one, who is Tony Horton and how did the responsibility he threw your way help you grow and develop?
So he was the one who hired me for my first international school job. He saw me as somebody who was interested in getting into school leadership. Yeah, I think he saw potential, and he was willing and enthusiastic to take a chance on a young kid with limited leadership experience. He encouraged me to sign up to go to a leadership institute at the time called the Principals Training Center. So I was a student of it when it first started.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Years and years and years ago. He gave me a lot more responsibility at that international school. He spent some time with me sharing what I was doing well, what I was not doing well. So he's the one who really kind of opened doors for me in terms of increased responsibility. And for that, I'm grateful.
Wow, that's amazing. So like with the PTC, it's sort of like the Karate Kid. You're now on the other side.
Exactly.
That's fabulous. Okay, number two. What did Gary Kenny teach you about bringing your humanity to your work?
Gary is still alive. He's much older, and he is only about 2 or 3 hours away from me here. And I have to visit him at some point. Gary also worked at that school in Ethiopia, and he's probably one of the human beings that is just the heart is there just as much, if not more than the mind. I watched him interact with people. I watched him with certain gentleness and a certain embrace that he had with people, kind of invite people in to a place of safety and comfort so that they can be themselves. And I was still young at the time. And I just observed him do this. And I don't think I realized until much later on that I kind of picked up some of that from him. And again, I'm grateful that I had that opportunity when I was a young leader to learn how to do that and to kind of show who I am vulnerably and softly to others so that they too can feel that way.
And that has even more meaningly when we talk about, leadership being one of those positions that has to deal with these massive disruptions that come quite regularly. And if your humanity is on display and you bring it to your work, that's part of the great leadership that you exert as you go through those kinds of things, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, number three. What did Carol Johnson model for you in terms of the politics of education?
Carol Johnson was the superintendent of the Minneapolis public schools during the years that I was the director of a public magnet school in Minneapolis. It was in between many of my international school assignments. I was the director of something called the Interdistrict Downtown School, and I reported to a board. Let me just really quickly, Josh.
Yeah.
It was a magnet school that basically was aimed at voluntary integration. So the premise is that forced desegregation over the years has pretty much been a failure over the years.
Yeah.
And this was a chance to say voluntarily, let's integrate schools. Let's have school districts sign up with some monetary incentives in terms of per pupil revenue. Let's have them sign up for an integration school experience. I reported as the director of that school for 5 years to a board that consisted of 10 public school superintendents.
Wow.
And talk about different sets of expectations and wants and desires being brought to the table. And Carol was the Minneapolis public school superintendent at the time. And I just talked to her a lot, but also observed how she found creative ways of bringing different groups of people with different perspectives about things together into a unified compromise. She was really quite expert at seeing where people were coming from and inviting them a little bit closer into a point in the circle where everybody can buy into it. That's something that I got from Carol in those years.
Wow. And it goes right back to what you were talking about civic discourse, about education, and being able to build those bridges. Fabulous. So, number 4, and finally, how did Roberto Saluti help you learn to navigate obstacles and barriers? Like, what was his secret sauce, if you will, that he apparently gifted to you?
Roberto was a chair of the board at a school in Sao Paulo, Brazil that I worked at. He's Brazilian, and it's a big generalization of what I'm about to say, but the Brazilian people often have a can-do outlook toward life. And Roberto took that to a very, very high level, ambitious, bold, visionary. And he taught me when I was superintendent of that international school, he taught me not to think too small, but to think big, to think boldly. That even if something, a new project or a new initiative is going to cost a lot of money, there are ways in which we can find ways to find resources for that initiative or that program. He taught me about being quite confident even when things were in their early stages, and the importance of a leader kind of making sure that those they're serving feel that confidence as you try to do something that's pretty bold. So that's what I got from Roberto, and I'm grateful for that.
Wow. You know, Lee, in Hawaii, we have a phrase, hiki no, and hiki no means can do in Hawaiian. And it sounds like Tony and Gary and Carol and Roberto were all hiki no folk.
Very much.
Does that sound right?
It is, and all in their different ways. But for sure, they were all can-do folks. I think they were all glass half full. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna here or anything like that, but I do think leadership requires a certain level of hope and belief and faith. And that's the good leaders that I've worked with, including Tony, Gary, Carol, and Roberto, kind of exhibit that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Lee Fertig, thank you so much for this time today. We'll dedicate this episode to Tony and Gary and Carol and Roberto. And I just can't wait to get this conversation out to our listeners. I really appreciate everything that you shared with me that allowed me to prepare for this episode. And boy, whatschoolcouldbe.org, all of us on the team, we're cheering you on. And if there's anything that we can do in the future to support your work, you let us know. And again, thank you for this time today.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciated our conversation. Thank you very much.
Our editor, creative consultant, and sound engineer is the talented Evan Kurohara. Our theme music is created by a remarkable pianist, Michael Sloan. Producer of 12 albums with over 100 songs, Michael Sloan is featured in Apple Music, Spotify, and all major music platforms. You can also find his work on his YouTube channel. Michael has listeners in over 100 countries and 2,000 cities. We'd be grateful if you would support these episodes with leading edge, innovative and imaginative educators and students by giving us your own rating and writing a review wherever you get your podcasts. This series is sponsored by Education Change Agent, Ted Dintersmith, executive producer of the award-winning documentary film, Most Likely to Succeed, and author of the best-selling book, What School Could Be. If you are committed to rolling up your sleeves and joining thousands of educators, business professionals, nonprofit leaders, and parents as we reimagine education to be relevant and learner-centered, please join the What School Could Be global online community. Simply log in to community.whatschoolcouldbe.org or download the What School Could Be app from your favorite app store. The What School Could Be podcast is brought to you by Josh Rapoon Productions. Send your feedback to josh@whatschoolcouldbe.org. Follow the show on Twitter @WSCB Podcast and on LinkedIn @Josh Rapoon. Listeners, one of the most important things we all can do is to bring kindness and compassion into the world. For sure, we need a surplus of both right now. Until next time, ahui ho, and thank you for listening to the What School Could Be podcast.